Hi everyone. With this commentary track, I wanted to sit down and watch one of my favorite James Cameron films, Aliens. To participate, all you have to do is grab a copy, a director's cut of Aliens, and push play when I tell you to, and you can listen to my commentary track as you watch the film. Without further ado, I'm going to push play now. Here we go. Pushing play now. Alright, things are underway here. The 20th Century Fox logo doesn't really look any different from the one featured in 1979. The audio sounds slightly different perhaps, but basically the same. And we have a very minimalistic opening, just black with white text, and then the slowly gradually sort of rising blue light to reveal the title of Aliens, which has its own sort of distinct look. This was James Cameron's second film. Apart from Aliens, the only other film that Cameron had directed and completed was The Terminator, which I consider to be his directorial debut. It's also interesting, a lot of this film is old enough, it's as old as I am, that a lot of the actors have moved on. Paul Reiser, of course, will be starring in Stranger Things Season 2. Lance Henriksen is still in the business. Michael Bain is not, though. Carrie Henn, since retired, despite being about my age, a little bit older. Bill Paxton is gone. William Hope, as far as I understand it, is still in the business. I saw him in Alien Isolation in 2014. It was a video game, but he was the head of security on board the Sebastopol. Now it says here that music is composed by James Horner, but of course this piece, I believe, is taken directly from the Guyang Ballet Suite by Aram Khachaturian, used in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I have to wonder, of course, if they took something directly from a recording or if they re-recorded it. I imagine to save on royalties, they probably didn't use a recording from another orchestra. The London Symphony Orchestra was used for the recording of the music in this film, and I imagine they probably played the music themselves to again save money. But it works very well here. It's also a musical coda because we have it in the credit sequence. Essentially, you have the music playing here while Ripley is asleep, and then when they sleep, being able to dream all the way home, the music plays again. If you look closely, you can see little props. The suit in the background, Ripley's helmet. The set, as far as I can tell, I don't know if they recycled it or if they rebuilt it, but it looks fairly convincing. As far as I can tell, there's only one sleep chamber in the ship, whereas in the original there was two, but again, we only see so much. I like the reflection of the monitor text on the glass, the idea that we saw certain reflections of monitor screens in Alien, even though it doesn't actually work like that. Almost looks like beer cans or something on the windowsill there. Maybe I'm seeing that wrong. This scene, of course, and if you look closely, you can see the harpoon gun beneath the door. This scene, of course, James Cameron had to pay out of his own pocket to get into the film. He had to buy a door cutter. I like how there's a nice contrast with the red of the sparks contrasting with the dull blue of the room. It's very striking. Excellent use of jump cuts and sound effects. This is, of course, sort of an homage to the Ridley Scott School of Photography. And it's done quite well, I think. And we have to wonder, given that this is sort of deep space and the size of the spacecraft, if you watch something the size of the intercepting spacecraft, we have to wonder, is this even a human vessel? The thing that first enters it, of course, notably is not human, but a gigantic arm that essentially extends a blue laser into the room. Again, blue, sort of solidifying the central sort of color theme that this film utilizes non-stop. Wonderfully lit, though. You can scarcely make out the silhouettes of the men as they step into the room one at a time. There's kind of a Spielberg feel to it, honestly. Sort of reminds me of E.T. when the men in suits make their way into the protagonist's home in that film. There's a lot of interesting or sort of slapdash sort of special effects that they make use in this film to save money, but also achieve maximum visual impact. The use of glitter is actually quite clever. It seems like something someone might do making a homemade film, to just go to the store and pick up whatever they need. Nice sort of fade here, Ripley's face sort of aligning with the circumference of the planet as the camera slowly pans to the space station. Not my favorite shot in the film. I always thought the space station looked very static, and not the most convincing model, if it is a model. This part of the film is very sterile. Again, like in Alien Covenant, where you have the opening between Peter Wayland and Walter, or David rather, or you have the opening sequence in Alien where they wake up in the sleep chamber, which is again sterile and white, sort of a nod to, say, Kubrick. But then as the films progress, they move away from this visual trope into sort of dirtier images. It provides a nice visual contrast, not necessarily a coda, though I suppose the sleep chambers at the end of the film are equally clean. The characters are cleaned up after doing battle. Paul Reiser as sort of a weaselly villain in this film. Not my favorite by any stretch of the imagination, but he does provide an interesting sort of foil or contrast to the human villain, or the humanoid villain Ash that we got in Alien. He brings something different to the universe, and he has a very expressive face. You can just notice his sort of sideways glances or idiosyncratic facial expressions as he's trying to painfully tell this story to Ripley, having drifted through the core systems for 57 years out there in deep space, only to be picked up by a deep salvage team. And again, what we have here, essentially, James Cameron has a tendency in his earlier films to have very tight editing, and he often disguises expositions as normal conversation. In this case, it's a nightmare sequence, but again, it's exposition and conversational dialogue sandwiched together in a nightmare sort of scenario to sort of demonstrate that Ripley's not entirely well in the head, that she has a lot of pent-up stress. Nice ECU of Jones there. And, of course, the music synchronizes very well with the imagery. When the glass shatters or things fall over, you have that musical sort of spike. The use of slow motion, very, very much predominantly used in the Terminator. We see make a return here as things get tense. And a nice, simple sort of special effect. In 1979, they had a fiberglass body for Kane. I have to wonder if they did something similar and then stretched fake skin over it for that scene, pushing it up in a very similar fashion to the classic sort of special effects that we saw in the original chestburster scene. The first of many extended or deleted scenes inserted into the director's cut of the film. This one I don't mind, especially because it was the main inspiration for the making of Alien Isolation in 2014. Without this scene in the director's cut, they wouldn't have made that game, and it was a fabulous entry into the series, so ultimately I don't mind it. I like there's a certain busy quality to, like many of the sets in James Cameron's films, there's often a lot going on. This particular shot, of course, is just the two actors talking, but if you look at the start of the scene in the background, you can see people rushing to and fro. Of course, Paul Reiser is giving her a spiel about who she'll be facing, but all she wants to know is what happened to her daughter, Amanda Ripley McLaren. It's interesting, of course, in 2014 when Alien Isolation ends, we never learn what happens to her. But here, of course, we learn her true fate, that she dies. Dot matrix printing paper, sort of an anachronism, but in those days it would have been top of the line. I remember that in elementary school. I used to go to the secretary's office and they had dot matrix printed paper. This is actually, of course, a photograph of Sigourney Weaver's mother. They used it to get, or to inspire an emotional response from Ripley. She really pulled out all the stops in this film to achieve the greatest performance I think that she could deliver. Is it the best one in her career? I'm not entirely sure, but I know that she was nominated for the Academy Awards in 1986 for a science fiction film as Best Actress. I mean, how often does that happen? Not very. Excellent performance all around. I love that too, that ECU of Parker's face before it sort of pulls back and with a point of view shot over Ripley's shoulder. This film, of course, has a lot of parallels to Ridley Scott's Alien. And essentially what we have here in this scene, apart from all the exposition, again disguised as normal sort of dialogue, is a rotating shot around a table. Just like an Alien at the breakfast table, when the crew are sitting around the table, except here we have suits. They're all sort of androgynous, technically male and female, and yet they're all wearing the same suits. A suit is a suit. And they're all doing something. And they're all, of course, smoking. You can see glass cigarette ashtrays as they're, one guy's playing with his crossword. A couple of them are eating donuts. For them, this is just the first order of business of the day. But for Ripley, it's sort of a defining moment in her life. Wonderful dialogue. Just the idea that this really pays homage to the first film. There's a lot of accuracy in regards to the detail. Of course, you have that sort of strangely microfilmic screen in the background. Essentially something like on a reel or a projector that they're just kind of running up and down. But it's a nice sort of nod. And again, this female character who's sort of interrogating her is wearing a suit just like the boys. Not sure about her haircut either. None of these characters are particularly attractive either. They're just sort of androgynous, almost sexless, barely human even. Again, this for them is just the first order of business. They're there to talk about money, 42 million in adjusted dollars. That's minus payload. They don't really care about Ripley's story about the creature. They just care about money and having some type of response to sort of penalize Ripley for her actions at costing the corporation money. And Paul Reiser is, of course, an extension of that, but he's a bit more ambitious. Now, this particular bit of deleted footage where we hear the ruling established isn't something that I feel is entirely necessary. I can see why they cut it out, because in the next scene with Ripley in her apartment, she says, "You guys throw me to the wolves," and we never actually hear what happens to her. You know, the actual ruling or sentence that they hand out. So it's a little bit redundant here. It makes the film longer. But it's not really necessary for them to spell it out because we can sort of determine it through the dialogue, and the film is constantly moving. And of course we have this line by Paul Reiser that could have been better, that in the theatrical version of the film gives us a pretty good idea of how things went. They don't have to spell things out for us. We can figure it out for ourselves. I like movies that do that. Don't just have obvious expository dialogue that sort of spells how things go out. You can kind of deduce. Be a detective. Of course, we realize that Ripley went into this situation not really that prepared, whereas the company knew exactly what the status of the colony was on LV-426, the shake and bake colony. As far as they know, the colonists are alive and well. 60, maybe 70 families. And we have a cut to LV426. As far as I know it, in the script, James Cameron called it Archeon. I'm not 100% sure about that. At least hope. Population 158. A nice little detail like that. Not my favorite part of the film by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, in the theatrical version of the film, we never see any of this. This is probably the longest scene that they cut from the theatrical version. But there's all the classic sort of special effects and photography that you know and expect from James Cameron in regards to the intense lighting of the flashlights and the lights of the colony, and the smoke, the use of models and miniatures, sound effects that are recycled from the Terminator. And this shot is largely reminiscent of Lieutenant Traxler and Val from Terminator, essentially the comic relief duo. It's also told in a similar fashion photographically, single take, free motion, as the camera follows the two characters through a colony station as opposed to a police station. And we have, again, exposition disguised as conversational dialogue. It feels natural. That's the important thing. It's not like modern films where you have a narrator who just spells things out in a very narrator-like fashion. It doesn't draw attention to itself. It feels like two guys having a conversation, and it's kind of funny, which again sort of distracts from the quality of it being exposition. It doesn't draw attention to itself. This is, of course, the one scene in the film where we see inside the colony before it's ransacked by the invading alien forces. Nice little sort of visual nod to Weyland-Yutani Corp. Building better worlds. I can't even remember in the theatrical cut if they mention the logo or not. I think maybe they do once briefly in Ripley's apartment. Not a huge fan of that Land Rover or whatever it is. I like this particular shot where it sort of drives up over the hill through the mist and the smoke. But there's a certain sort of transparent quality to the mist or the fog. Normally you think, okay, it would be sort of obfuscating or opaque. But instead, you can see largely just about everything. All the details of the derelict, by and large. There's sort of a Lost in Space sort of vibe here. You have a small blonde son named Timmy, a mom and pop survey team. It's very, very much an homage, a blatant or naked homage to that television show, which, interestingly enough, was set in 1997, in the future. Of course, they decide not to call it in. They're going to go off exploring, and one thing that I want to point out, a lot of people tend to criticize other films, especially those by Ridley Scott, for Alien Covenant, for instance, where they go exploring without helmets. And if you pay attention here, you'll notice that these characters are not wearing helmets. They are going into this situation not radioing ahead saying, hey, we're doing this, and they're merely wearing safety goggles and having flashlights as they walk hand in hand while they leave their kids in the rover. Not terribly bright. But again, it's a trope. It's a trope of sorts. We know that it's a haunted house. We know that these characters are going into a haunted house even if they don't. And that's part of the fun of the viewing experience. Not that it's intelligent, but that it's entertaining in various shapes or form. Sort of a nod to the original scene in Alien where Dallas and his co-pilots are walking through the bone ship's corridors, and we can see the bones glistening in the dark. Here you can see that very briefly, though again it's somewhat dissipated. The effect is visually by the constant flickering lights, the blue lights in the background, the lightning. Again, James Cameron being obsessed with blue light, flickering blue light, and the the analog lighting that he would use in this film and in the Terminator. Very quiet, this particular scene. Very, very little sound effects, which of course is shattered almost immediately when we build up to this jump scare right here. This is actually, I don't like the scene itself very much, but this cut where she starts screaming, and the scream is actually drowned out by the hissing of the planet's atmosphere, is very reminiscent of some of the cuts that they did in Alien. Again, more parallels with the parent film. Also some visual sort of parallels between Ripley's hand and the facehugger. It's a wonderful shot. An extreme close-up of her hand. And then panning up to her face as she kind of sits there almost comatose or statuesque. It's a wonderful cut. The scene itself, not so much, but the end of the scene and the transition is fabulous. I love her reaction here. And in the original version of the film, all this stuff that they would have tacked on wouldn't have existed. We basically go from her bemoaning the fact that there are 60 or 70 families in danger to her being in this apartment. It's much faster in the theatrical version of the film. James Cameron has a wonderful tendency, at least in his early films, to have these sets that would feel like sets, and yet he makes them feel cluttered or lived in. Having just watched Terminator again and comparing Sigourney Weaver's apartment to Ginger and Sarah's, it's just a wonderful use of props to make it feel like she actually lives here. It's kind of messy, kind of cluttered. I think it's kind of deceptive here. Gorman is very calm, very collected, seems to believe what he is doing is just sort of businesslike. But this scene doesn't really sort of match up later in the film, because again, Burke is really insisting that she go, whereas we learn later in the film, he actually, the types of plans that he has in order to sort of get rich, we discover, would have borne more fruit potentially had he not actually invited her along. And why is it so important for him that she go along? I have no idea. Perhaps he wants to sort of kill two birds with one stone and have something go wrong with Ripley, and thus have no one to sort of cross-check or counter his story when he tries to sneak creatures through quarantine on the return journey home. Of course, I'm sort of reading into that a bit deeply, but I can't really think of anything else off the top of my head. If you go, of course, the company itself is actually offering to pick up her contract again if she goes. But I'm not sure why it's so important to them or Burke, who again has his own independent interests separate from the company's. But just like in Alien, the interests of the company by and large remain mysterious. Whereas Burke, we learn, just wants to get money, though we don't learn that right away. But in retrospect, after watching this scene and comparing it to some of the later footage in the film, his actions don't particularly make any sense, just like those of Ash the android in the first film. And again, the two men walk out, leaving her to her business. And I love that too. It's a quiet shot, and then suddenly she sits upright, and we have essentially what amounts to a jump scare. Some excellent acting by Sigourney Weaver. Again, she's by herself in front of the camera, and she has to convey a tremendous amount of emotional distress. Essentially, the true test of an actress, and she does a great job, I think. Sort of a quiet scene, free motion camera. The lighting and photography is very reminiscent of, well, very consistently James Cameron. Very similar to that of the Terminator. His films always look photographically similar, his earlier works. Which is nice, where you have a director that can deliver content that is visually recognizable like that. I always wondered why he looked over his shoulder. I think he was looking at those two clocks in the corner. I never really thought about that before. Of course, she wants to go and wipe out these creatures, and she's trusting Burke, or perhaps she doesn't really care what he says, and this part of the conversation is purely symbolic, just sort of a gesture. It's like, hey, you're going to screw me over? It's not that she actually believes what he says. I find it sort of interesting, though. Again, she's seeking catharsis or some type of closure after what happened to her on board the Nostromo, and yet she knows that according to Ash, these creatures can't be easily killed. Though again, perhaps it's just the fact that Gorman did a fairly good job convincing her through his professional attitude that he can get the job done, so to speak. Though we find out relatively quickly later on that he doesn't have what it takes. If you notice, there's actually a centerfold there, a bit of 1980s bush porn. The only nudity that we really get in the film that we can see somewhat clearly. This is, of course, again another parallel with Ridley Scott's Alien, where you have the sleeping ship, where the camera slowly drifts almost dreamlike or ghost-like through the ship. A nice sort of transition, I think, between shots. Basically, the right side of one shot and the left side of the other shot sort of concealed by darkness as they splice the footage together. At least I think that's what they did. Maybe they passed through a doorway, I'm not sure. Again, though, the sleeping ship. We see bits of motion in what is otherwise a lifeless boat at sea. I forget what those are called. I don't think they're called Newton's cradles, but I could be wrong. You'll notice that some of the doors in this locker room or whatever it is have kick marks, almost as though they've been kicked, as though the inhabitants are rowdy. And again, like a sort of a visual coda here, where we have this monitor or screen that blips to life, and we see the scrolling names of the characters very briefly, almost the entire crew, I believe, before they wake up. Another visual nod to Alien, where you have the rising sleep chambers as they open. I always liked a lot of the sound effects used in this film. They did a better job of the editing. A bit of sexualized shot of Ripley, not so sexualized or sexy anyways, of Hudson. Drake. It's interesting, a lot of these cast members I can recall from their names of the characters in the film, but I can't always remember the actors' names. That's, of course, William Hope. Hicks, played by Michael Bain. The late, great Bill Paxton in perhaps his most famous role. Apone, I forget the actor's name in this particular case. He delivers a very recognizable canonical performance. Seems to be sort of a visual inconsistence. Some of these Marines are in very good shape, some of them are not. It's interesting, too, that tattoo that Bill Paxton had, a collar of barbed wire, if you will. And again, this scene is essentially moving action. There's stuff going on visually, and then we have what is essentially aimless banter between some of the crew members, which is actually, again, exposition. Apparently, she's supposed to be some type of consultant. You could call it gossip, but it also kind of spells out how the crew feels about their new consultant in their ranks. Also, Jeanette Goldstein demonstrating her physical prowess. She had a gym membership when she was auditioning for this film, so she spent a lot of time working out in the 1980s. And the mysterious relationship between Drake and Vasquez. Are they lovers? Are they friends? Hard to say. Probably buddies, and nothing more, nothing less. But the film doesn't really sort of spell it out for us. It's interesting, too, watching this particular scene. I'm not sure what Arcturians are. They talk about that. I think that's Spunkmeyer. If you look closely, though, you have Crow and Where's Basky. who are the film's two red shirts in this particular instance. I don't even know if you can see them here. They have almost no scenes or lines in the film, and they exist only to be fodder during the atmospheric processor sequence. Again, another scene of essentially what amounts to exposition disguised as sort of a gag, where what is the point of this scene? Well, the point of the scene is that Hudson likes the trick with the knife, the thing with the knife, but we also learn that not everyone on board the ship, the Sulaco, is actually human. A bit of a classic sort of special effects shot there, speeding up the footage. If you look closely, you can see that some of the actors are moving around in sort of a comical manner, but at the same time, your attention is on the knife, so it may not be that easy to sort of notice. There are things on screen that sort of distract you. Cornbread, sort of an homage or nod to the breakfast sequence in Alien, where the characters in that film are also eating cornbread. Food of slaves or servants, at least historically in the slavery period of the United States. And these are United States colonial marines. It's essentially gruel, not exactly what you would call glorified ambrosia. And again, I even though I'm not entirely a fan of Paul Reiser's weasel-like villain, and at this point in the film we don't even know that he's a villain really, just sort of untrustworthy, potentially self-serving, but just wonderful delivery. His facial expression is very sort of frantic, and we see one shot very quickly of Where's Basky there, looking up with the other Marines, but he's almost not in the film at all. Characters like Frost or Hicks get a lot more screen time, actual lines. There are a few, again, red shirts in this film. As far as I can tell, parts of this set are actually I'm not entirely sure if this entire thing is a soundstage, but it almost looks like certain things are screens or matte paintings. I don't think they built this entire thing to scale. They certainly cut corners, but they were able to do a fairly good job of it. Things move along so quickly. You don't have a lot of time to sort of focus in on what you're looking at. Xenomorph. And this is the scene, a scene where Ripley has her first sort of opportunity to be an advisor. But we notice that there's already a certain lack of preparedness amongst the crew. I'm sorry we didn't have time to brief you people before we left Gateway. And this is the first moment where we realize that they haven't really listened or paid attention to her report, and they're essentially gossiping about her in the locker room. But this is the first opportunity for them to really be educated by her, and they're very dismissive of it. And this is kind of par for course for the first section of the film. They don't really listen to Ripley at all until she pulls their asses out of the fire later on, underneath the atmospheric processor. If you look closely, you can see that Paul Reiser's character, Burke, is kind of smirking a little bit, almost as though he expects for her not to be taken seriously, which again begs the question, why did he have her come along at all? Why was the company interested in having her come along? She easily could have recorded everything on disc, which again, Gorman points out. Again, we have a report on disc. I suggest you study it. And if they're going to ignore her in person, they may as well just ignore her on disc and not have another civilian to worry about. But it's important to have a central protagonist. And Ripley very much is this film's central hero. Certainly isn't Hudson. Very much the comic relief of this film. We have a bit of sort of pseudo-Andrea, false courage by Gorman here, trying to act sort of serious, professional, and it's sort of a change in his professional, sort of straightforward behavior. He comes across initially as bland, sort of indifferent, but when people start, giving him shit, he has to actually act a bit tough. Sort of lays down the punishment. We think, okay, is this a guy who can get things done? Of course, we learn later on that is not the case. Again, it's sort of false courage. I always like that particular shot. This, of course, we ask, what is the point of this scene? With the, I'll give you a look closely here, you can see strings. Yeah, you can see strings on the missiles almost. Or maybe that's sort of a visual sort of... But the idea, what is the point of this scene? Everyone sort of walking to and fro. Again, it's a very busy scene, and just about every scene in James Cameron's film is fast. And we have dialogue between them, which is, again, just sort of disguised as conversation, and that we learn she has a Class 2 rating, she can drive this loader. This is a coda of sorts, and we'll be returning to this later in the film. Essentially, it's Chekhov's gun, or in this case, Chekhov's power loader. Or we learn that whilst wearing Reeboks, Ripley can pilot this loader, and she'll be using it to fight the Queen at the very end of the film. So every scene in this film has a point. This isn't just a pointless scene where we get a bit of a laugh. It's not just comic relief. It's comic relief. It's character development. It's also foreshadowing. It's a lot of different things all at once. It's also a great use of special effects. You have essentially what, as far as I understand it, muscle men in styrofoam outfits that Ripley's effectively, or the other actors, are standing on. It's just a gag, but it looks great. It's very convincing. Great use of sound effects to make it seem as though these things are actually made out of metal when they're actually made out of styrofoam. Classic Hollywood sleight of hand. I love the focus of these shots, how the camera is largely focused on the weapons that these Marines are wielding. She may be small, but she stands toe-to-toe with Drake. Some nice camera work here as we see Pharaoh and company getting ready to touch down on the planet. I always enjoyed the APC, one of my favorite parts of the film in regards to the non-human members of the crew. Again, everything is very busy here. Everything is moving. It's constantly, there's something going on. Characters are putting on helmets. I think if you look closely, you can see Crow here. Yep, there's Crow. Puts on his helmet. He's just he's there to sort of fatten the ranks, fatten the herd, because again, these Marines act tough, but large numbers of them are going to be thinned by the wolves we encounter later. But it's a nice demonstration of the bravado, the false courage of these overconfident space soldiers. I like how the smart guns sort of fit vertically into the body of the APC. Perhaps another parallel with Alien, we have this sort of floating or moving chair that Gorman sits in, very much like Ash in the bubble, or the Blister in his moving chair as he sort of resides and lords over the expedition into unknown territory. A great use of miniatures and models. As far as I understand it, this ship that we see, the external ship, is actually a miniature. It looks great though, very convincing. And you have a lot of cross-cutting between this miniature and Pharaoh and Spunkmeyer and everyone else. Great use of cross-cutting in this scene. Especially since you have so many faces. You focus on the hero for part of it, you focus on the pilot, You have her voice in the background over the radio, just superbly made. I also love her glasses. She's effectively the woman with no eyes. Like Hudson's classic line. Essentially, they're dropped like a bomb here, and they shoot very quickly towards the planet, sort of rotating until they're plummeting vertically through the planet's atmosphere. I think in Alien Covenant it was perhaps a little bit more how it actually would happen, where they descend much more slowly. But again, here it's meant to be exciting. Everything that comes out of Pharaoh's mouth is pure gold. We're in the pipe 5x5. Rough air in for some chop. I like how she translates it for the Marines, because Spunkmeyer says the jargon, and then she spits out the slang for the Marines who aren't going to know what the hell Spunkmeyer's talking about. Also, like that she's represented, her autonomy is represented visually through the glasses. She looks cool wearing them. Almost a little bit unknowable too, because her eyes are hidden. Or Spunkmeyer isn't wearing any. Almost looks sort of like an underling. But she very much is, because she's bossing him around. She's the pilot, he's the co-pilot. And we learn, of course, at this point that through the harmless sort of tension of this elevator sequence, so to speak, Gorman can't even handle this type of pressure, which only sort of foreshadows the problems to come as they start to encounter threat after threat on the planet itself. Interesting sort of visual lack of continuity here. We notice that it's established that Hicks is actually asleep, and yet in this upcoming extended sequence or deleted sequence they reinserted into the director's cut of the film, we see that Hicks is actually awake. Maybe he dozed in and out of sleep. The Fonz way of addressing technical hiccups, smashing them in caveman-like fashion. Yep, if you look behind Hudson, you can see that Hicks is well awake during this scene. Is it really necessary to have this scene? Perhaps not, but it is a bit of fun. And I will say that Bill Paxton playing Hudson gives it his all. Fry half the city with this puppy. Phase plasma pulse rifles, a bit like the phase plasma rifles at the 40-watt range in Terminator. Bit of James Cameron sort of referencing his first film. I can see why they cut it, but it is a bit of fun. Somebody wake up Hicks, but of course in that scene, I think one reason they cut it was because Hicks was asleep, and then in the deleted sequence, Hicks was awake. I love that model with the unfolding sort of wings. Where's the damn beacon? Excellent windows here. The live windows. Something that Cameron wanted to address. This scene, again, speaking of parallels with Alien, is essentially paralleling a parallel to the scene in Alien, where you have the ground team led by Captain Dallas that are going to investigate the beacon, the acoustical beacon on LV-426, and everything is told through cameras, through their heads-up displays. And here we have the cameras of the ship, and we see everything again through a monitor, through a screen. And everything is sort of obscured by film grain and almost sperm-like lights there with that sort of the tails or ghost-like. It's almost ghostly, and it's very well shot. And I could see them shooting this again with a camcorder, almost like home footage. The obscuring of the landing ship, just like the Nostromo and Alien, hiding things with smoke. Bit of stop motion there as the APC disembarks. Cross-cutting. So again, you have cross-cutting, and there's a bit of a divide, if you will, or a disconnect between special effects shots and shots of the actors themselves. There are very few sort of Gothic shots in this film, but they disguise it really well with a good use of cross-cutting and special effects. Bit of an establishing shot as we see the colony, the ECU of those really, really cool binoculars that Apone has. I always wanted a pair of those as a kid. And again, another parallel here between Aliens and Alien, where Gorman, lording over this exposition, is presiding or sitting like in a rotating or mobile throne, just like Ash in the Blister again. And he's sitting from relative safety, telling these people, his underlings, that, telling them what to do, issuing orders. There are some differences, of course. Gorman and Ash couldn't be any more far removed as characters. I love this particular shot when the doors open and Vasquez sort of readies her weapon. It's a very coordinated sort of approach towards the facility. It's wonderfully shot. It takes a certain amount of coordination with the actors and the camera crew to sort of pull something like this off. In the theatrical version of the film, this would be our first shot of the inside of the colony. I love this. They pull open the doors, a very Wizard of Oz-like feel, except instead of Dorothy stepping into Munchkinland, we have the Marines stepping into the trashed colony on LV-426. Hadley so completely annihilated. Another parallel to Alien, of course, you have things left to the viewer's imagination. When Dallas is pulled into the vents in the theatrical cut of that film, we're left to imagine what happens to him. And here we have an instance of the viewer being left to imagine what happened to Hadley's Hope, which is why I think they originally cut that extended scene from the theatrical cut of Aliens. And I think it works a little bit better. Why bloat the film when you can shorten it and leave things to the viewer's imagination? As Ridley Scott once said, nothing is stronger. Nicely shot, though. You have this slow, sort of gradual pulse. Perhaps sort of audio sort of synchronizing with the visuals of the motion trackers. You'll notice that all of the screens that they're looking through, again, have a certain amount of interference, adding to the tension of the scene. While Ripley, sort of mirroring the audience, is very intently staring at what these monitors are revealing as the Marines conduct their sweep, if you will. I always like the motion trackers. It's nothing particularly new, though. If you watch The Thing from Another World, they had a similar type of tracker. If you watch Alien, again, another parallel with that film. I apologize if I'm drawing a lot of parallels with Ridley Scott's Parent Picture, but it's something that I wanted to do with this particular commentary. I hope you don't find it too disruptive. It's certainly a trope, these types of films, though. Having a tracking device is something that you see in a lot of different films. Great use of the props, though. You can see the little screens lighting up as the Marines sweep through the corridors, holding their weapons, looking very tough. And this is very businesslike, of course. Sort of par for the course for these tough hombres. I'm not sure how they calibrate these motion trackers, but they're able to pick up life forms that aren't the Marines or the civilian members of their team. Of course, this particular deleted scene is completely unnecessary, given that what we have is a demonstration of how the motion trackers work, and yet we get a demonstration almost immediately after the scene with Newt, making the scene effectively redundant. Bit of sped up footage there. It also suggests that this particular event happened relatively recently, as those animals probably want to be able to survive for long in their cages without fresh food. Perhaps that the loss of contact on LV-426 happened in a matter of days, perhaps a week, maybe a week or two. but any longer than that, probably not. I did want to say that perhaps no one paid attention to Ripley's report, but at least Hicks was paying attention. Looks melted. Looks like somebody bagged one of Ripley's bad guys here. Acid with blood. Perhaps the only way that Hicks would know that is if he were paying attention. But he seems to be the only one who actually gives what she says any sort of credence. A bit of a miscalculation by Apone. This place is dead. Whatever happened here, we missed it. What they fail to realize is that the aliens come out at night, and that this place isn't dead at all, merely sleeping at Cthulhu at R'lyeh, only waiting to be re-invoked for murder, as Dr. Morbius said in Forbidden Planet. This particular scene I like. What we have here is effectively a model, and they light it in such a way that as it's sort of rolling through the streets here, it turns, and then you have a cut to the actual APC itself. Gorman and the civilians sort of descend from it, essentially sacrificing their safety from inside the APC. It does beg the question why they even set foot on the planet when they could have ordered the Marines to and fro from the safety of the Sulaco. I do like this particular shot, though. It sort of establishes how they enter into the colony and gives us a sense of it having more than just one entrance, Southlock. I also like this little bit of fragility or moment of nerves with Ripley. And again, the doors shutting, the use of sound effects sounds really solid, but it also says, hey, they're entering here. Now they're inside and the doors are closed. They're inside the trap. In the theatrical cut, you would just have Gorman and company sort of entering through this hole. And it just kind of expedited things. But that was one particular deleted scene that I'm glad that they put into the director's cut. I think it works really well. Again, more use of imagining what happened to the colonists here. Last Stand must have been a hell of a fight. And yet, we don't see any of it. And it works pretty well for it, I think. If you look closely, you can see on the monitor screens that everything is sort of turned on still. Almost as if the creatures sort of swept through and they came in the night and just stole everyone away in a single terrifying moment. Very much like the Great Machine in Forbidden Planet. Once turned on, in a single night the entire Krell race was destroyed. In a single night, the aliens came through and took everyone. The colonists didn't have time to turn everything off. Everything is as it was while they were alive. I like this shot. Initially, you have Sigourney Weaver, we're not even sure what she's looking at, and all you can see is her facial reaction, sort of accented by Horner's music. And then we cut to whatever it is she's looking at, and we realize that she had good reason to be worried. A nice little subtle shot there where she's startled by Hicks as he touches her arm. Doesn't draw attention to itself. And the facial expressions of the actors, Hicks in particular, how worried he looks. Burke, on the other hand, we know that he has dollar signs in his eyes, but perhaps he's not quite selling that as much as he would normally. He doesn't want to draw too much attention to his greed. But we do notice that he's unable to look away, and he gets a little bit too close for comfort, suggesting that his greed is foolhardy in nature. A very Geiger-esque sort of underbelly for these facehuggers, much more sexualized than the version in 1979, where essentially they use seafood. A bit of backstory here in regards to Bishop reading the medical charts for someone who died. They killed him in taking it off. Which is interesting. We have an answer to what would have happened had Dallas and company tried to cut the creature off in Alien. Though in that particular instance, we don't know how the person died. If they died from asphyxiation, lack of oxygen, or perhaps acid. And now, in the theatrical version, we have our first instance of the motion tracker actually being activated. If you look on the chests of the Marines, you can see their heraldry, almost like knights, and each one has his own symbol. Frost has a heart with an arrow through it. Hicks has a heart as well, oddly enough, with a lock through it. I don't believe that particular costume sort of choice was made by him personally, but the actor who preceded him, who was cut from the production after he and Cameron had various disagreements. They had to discontinue their professional relationship, with Cameron being the victor, of course. He is, after all, the director. I love how tense Hicks is holding his rifle. He's ready for anything. He also is a little bit quicker on his feet. He's able to spot that whatever this is actually human and not an alien threat. Which again suggests that he's paid attention to Ripley's report. It's like, that's not a xenomorph. That's a human girl. You also notice there's actually a bit of a mistake there with the sound effects. Drake fires his weapon, but it emits sounds that are released when the pulse rifle fires, not the smart gun. Again, there's a bit of a quick use of imagination where every time we have a revealing shot, we always see Ripley's face first, and then it cuts to whatever she's looking at, which gives us a very brief moment to sort of imagine. This film really takes advantage of the viewer's imagination. Also, just like in The Terminator, when Michael Biehn is bit on the hand by Linda Hamilton in that film, Carrie Henn bites him on the hand in this film. A trend that I believe is continued in The Abyss, when Coffee is bit on the hand by the protagonist of that film, played by Ed Harris. Sort of a messy, almost like a child's makeshift room. It reminds me when I was a kid. My father was constantly at work. My mother was bipolar, a bit sick. We children were left to fend for ourselves, so this sort of looks what my room would have looked like as a child. I love that fan. I have to wonder, is that a real fan? No? Is she going to hit her head on that? What if her hair got caught in it? Speaking of which, I always liked Ripley's sort of bob, or cropped, curly hairdo in this film. Looks like something out of the 40s and 50s almost, just given how curly it is. It's not really styled, though. But that's what leaps to mind. She kind of reminds me of Rosie DeRiver there, which is, I think, probably intentional to some degree. Perhaps not. Newt isn't really my favorite character in the film. I realize that she exists to give Ripley some sense of purpose. Early on in the film, of course, Ripley spends most of the film not having anything to do, being a fifth wheel, and if Newt didn't exist in the film, Ripley as a character would have much less to do, much less purpose. As a part of the healing process, of course, she is given something to do with Newt. Her maternal instincts kick in, and as we learned in the earlier deleted scene, her own daughter is dead, and this gives her an opportunity to heal in a way that she might not have had otherwise. It's addressing an issue that she encountered in this film after learning that her daughter was dead, and allows her to sort of pick herself up and actually sort of embark on something that sort of occupies herself. It gives her a sense of autonomy to look after this girl, to care for her, when none of the Marines seem very invested in that particular investment. And we see that she sort of has a more motherly approach to Gorman, who has clearly no sort of tact or ability to approach or deal with children. And we see a different side of Ellen Ripley than we did in Alien. I will say that Sigourney Weaver does a pretty good job here, as does Carrie Henn, who again is sort of designed in this particular scene not to say anything. Ripley herself even commenting, "You don't talk much, do you?" So while I'm not entirely sold on the motherly aspects of this, and the idea that, again, you have the Madonna or the Immaculate Conception, the surrogate mother, I do appreciate that it gives something for Ripley to do to establish her autonomy that she doesn't have when trying to communicate with the Marines. Personal data transmitters. Something that I always wondered why they didn't scan from orbit to determine. Perhaps if they can travel from one side of the galaxy to the other, why can't they scan for personal data transmitters from orbit? A minor detail, not something you really think about while you're watching the film. Hindsight 2020, as they say. Of course, at this point in the film, you'll notice that the characters that know the truth aren't listened to. No one listens to Ripley. No one also listens to Newt, who actually survived this particular instance. The testimony of the survivors is ignored by the foolhardy, the overconfident, confident. Newt has survived this disaster on LV-46 at Hadley's Hope, and yet when she says, "They're dead, can we go now?" she's ignored. Also, interestingly enough, throughout this entire scene, we have no sort of depiction as to what Farrow and Spunkmeyer are up to. We won't hear from them again until after the massacre underneath the atmospheric processor. But I do wonder what they're doing. All of the Marines are, of course, communicating through radio, and when Gorman and company are inside the APC, they can see what the Marines see underneath the atmospheric processor. Do Farrow and Spunkmeyer? We never learn. They effectively disappear. A bit of a screenwriting sort of plot hole, if you will, something that sort of goes unexplained, and not for the betterment of the film in that particular instance. What were they doing? Playing cards? Smoking? Perhaps a bit of a parallel again to Ridley Scott's Alien. We have two androids in both of those films, Ash and Bishop respectively, looking over their specimens, sort of peering through microscopes, inspecting their magnificent specimens, the way that Lance Henriksen phrases it. Stop Your Grin and Drop Your Linen, which comes from a song by AC/DC off their album Back in Black. Again, sort of a rock and roll persona that Hudson sort of embodies. Of course, at this point, I find it curious that the personal data transmitters aren't able to sort of exhibit or broadcast the life signs or vitals of the colonists. Unknown. Looks like all of them. Again, just like Dallas and company in Alien, talking about the SOS. Human, unknown. What kind of a transmission? And they're sitting around talking about that, and then again, just little lines of dialogue that sort of connect the two films. When James Cameron made this film, he was very much sort of paying homage to a director that he had nothing but tremendous respect for. It really shows in this film. I like this particular establishing shot, again, sort of a matte painting with stop motion, some type of analog effect to animate the tiny dwarfed APC. Then, of course, again, that disconnect where we go from a matte painting or something like that to an actual shot of a vehicle entering. Or, I believe that particular one was a model, and now we have the actual APC itself and the actors. One of the larger sets, I think, visually, because again, most of the sets in this film don't have the same Gothic feel that they do in Alien. But here, it looks fairly large, if only for a single shot. Yeah, them proceeding through this large sort of hallway filled with pipes and machinery. I believe these steps and these stairs are what Ripley sort of she makes her way through later in the film when she's trying to rescue Newt on her suicide mission. Of course, you'll notice there's a sort of visual sort of contrast. At this point in the film, the set is fine, nothing's wrong, and when Ripley's doing it, the set is completely trashed, filled with light, fire, and smoke. This scene, speaking of parallels with Alien, is sort of riffing off Dallas being in the air ducts. I'll get more about that in a moment. This particular shot, though, I love this transition. Seeing through the monitor, you have a forced perspective shot where they actually took something and placed it over the camera to create what appears to be a large ceiling, when in point in fact it is not. Excellent use of a very simple special effect to make the set seem larger than it is. One thing that I will say about some of the scenes in this film, the way that they're photographed, unfortunately, we didn't get exactly what we wanted. The director of photography and James Cameron they had words, so to speak, disagreeing over how this scene should be shot, and James Cameron wanted it to be shot in such a way to obscure a lot of the detail. Unfortunately, what we get is something much more brightly lit, and as a result, this looks much more like a set than, say, the tunnel. And again, speaking of that shot right there, that point of view shot of them progressing through this claustrophobic tunnel, with, in the upper left-hand corner, the bone sort of protruding towards the camera, is very much like Dallas and Company being heralded or ushered into the derelict through a similar point of view shot in Alien, except in that film, the set is obscured by shadows. All you can see are bones glistening in the dark, allowing you to sort of imagine what you're looking at as it's in front of you. Whereas in this film, a lot less is left to the imagination. It looks very much like a set. This is an interesting sort of writing device, where it gives them an excuse to take away the soldiers' weapons, though they continue inside, regardless, only having shotguns and flamethrowers, which, if we learn anything through Alien Isolation or Alien, flamethrowers don't work particularly well against alien creatures, and neither do shotguns. Though I will say that in Alien Isolation, the creature Stompy was invincible. In this particular film, the creatures are dispatched rather satisfactorily by Hicks's shotgun, perhaps more satisfyingly than any other weapon. This is, of course, a Vietnam War commentary of sorts, where you have the greenhorn sort of lieutenants who would lead their men into dangerous situations. And this is perhaps the most frustrating example of Gordon's incompetence, as he tells the men to sort of disarm, but continue into danger regardless. Ripley is ignored, Newt is ignored, and they proceed inside. Even the Marines themselves, who are foolhardy and brave, realize that what they're doing is not particularly safe. And we see a brief shot of Where's Basky looking afraid. Again, one of the red shirts in the film who has no lines of dialogue, as far as I can tell. Maybe one. This particular part of the film isn't my favorite. Just in regards, this shot here, it's fairly static. Doesn't look particularly large. It looks like a set. The way that it's lit doesn't really help. There are some nice shots, though. I like this particular shot. We see the feet of the colonists as the camera slowly rises, revealing to us our first casualty of this war. Of course, it's very obvious to the people looking at these colonists that they are dead. Their chests are burst open. And you'll notice, however, that they continue to proceed inside, even though it's obvious that there are no survivors. If I were Ripley, I would say they're all dead. I know how these creatures operate. Look at them. You're not going to find anyone alive here. And yet they continue inside. I'm not sure what they're looking for. Though they do, of course, encounter one survivor. But what happens to her? She dies, expiring from a deadly parasitic infection with an alien life form. Which, of course, the Marines would know if they paid attention to Ripley's report. Or even Newt, for that matter, but they don't. But again, it's all part of the roller coaster ride, where we as an audience can anticipate that things are going to go wrong, that shit is going to hit the fan. It's meant to be entertaining, not necessarily intelligent, and the two don't necessarily go hand in hand, of course. Do you need intelligent behavior on screen to always have an entertaining sort of ride, cinematically speaking? I don't think so. And we, as an audience, know exactly what's going to happen here. And if we're not sure, one look on Ripley's face sort of says it all. This woman is doomed. Another parallel between Alien and Aliens. Essentially, you have the obligatory chestburster sequence in this instance. And if the Marines were sort of ignoring Ripley up to this point, this is something that they can't really ignore. It's as clear as day what type of danger they're in now. But even now, they're sort of confused. I think it's interesting that the creature dies. You have a chestburster that doesn't seem to have replacing its outer cells or outer layer with polarized silicone, like in the first film. It succumbs from the fire. Whereas generally speaking, any other instance where a flamethrower is used, it doesn't have any sort of effect on the creatures. I love those shots too, where we're not sure where these creatures are, but they're sort of closing in, and we can see them emerging from the walls, and we realize this entire time that they've been hiding in plain sight. And yet at the same time, we don't know where they are when they're being revealed to us, which creates a certain amount of tension as we look at Hudson's motion tracker and realize that they're completely surrounded. Essentially, the battle at Little Bighorn with Custer, if you will, going back further than even the Vietnam War that they're sort of commenting on here. I like this particular shot. Again, most of the shots in this particular scene don't look very massive, and yet the creature does descend from the ceiling. It's a fairly close-up shot, however. I often wondered how the creature was sort of ascending into the air. If you look closely, you can see a foot of a cameraman there as Frost descends into the abyss, plunging like Icarus, burning into the sea. And we have our first two casualties, of course, as Crow and Wierzbowski. The two characters in the film with no lines, essentially the red shirts, whose only purpose is to sort of die on screen, or in this case, essentially off screen. You have Crow, who bought the farm, and Wierzbowski, whose only speaking line in this film is to die off screen in red shirt fashion. I suppose if you want to make an omelet, you have to break a couple eggs. You have to demonstrate. I love that shot too, of as Drake and Vasquez are firing their weapons inside the atmospheric processor. Just no one shoots a daisy quite like James Cameron. Probably my least favorite death in the film is of Apone. Effectively, he doesn't even die. But we see these creatures underneath him, and we hear him maybe cry out in one single sort of moment. But we don't see what happens to him, and we're left to imagine him being gone in the same sense that Dallas is gone. No blood. Excuse me. No Dallas. And again, this particular scene, speaking of Aliens parallels, is meant to sort of mirror the scene in Alien where Dallas is in the vents. And things are going progressively. The warning signs continue to show themselves. Oh my god, it's moving right towards you. You have the blip of the motion tracker in that film. You have the blip of the motion tracker here, where they are surrounded and sort of moving in. And you're just sort of waiting for the alien to reach out and grab the potential victim in each respective case. This particular instance is an instance of heroism that doesn't really have anything to do with Ripley helping Newt with saving the Marines, pulling their asses out of the fire. And it was a question that I asked earlier. What would Ripley do in a situation where Newt wasn't under her care, wasn't her ward? And we do have an illustration of this about halfway through the film, where Ripley saves the Marines, does what needs to be done in order to for them to make it out alive, something that Gorman isn't really prepared to do, given how well he responds, or lack thereof, under pressure. I like the shot of it approaching the wall, but when it smashes through the wall, the sound effects and just the look of the The look at the material that she sort of plows through looks fairly flimsy, almost as though it's made out of tinfoil. Of course, you have some upside-down shots of some of the actors portraying xenomorphs, turning the camera upside down to give them the appearance as though they're walking on the ceiling. A simple special effect that doubtless saved them quite a bit of money. Probably one of my favorite demises in the film, where Drake goes down swinging, essentially deploying everything in his arsenal to sort of keep the creatures at bay while everyone else sort of makes it out. Sort of essentially going down in a blaze of glory. We also have a nice illustration of how the acid works. There are plenty of instances in this particular scene where we see that the screenplay allows the creatures to bleed acid. We'll notice that later on in the film, of course, anytime you have the central character who's meant to live to the end, they conveniently disable the creature's ability to bleed acid. But in this particular instance, nope. The creatures are all bleeding acid. Nice use of puppet effects there. As the creature opens its mouth, I absolutely love that, where Hicks blows its brains out with the shotgun. And you'll notice that acid goes everywhere, and Hicks his friend Hudson takes an armful of acid there. So it's risky to fight these creatures up close in this scene. That's what this scene is illustrating. It's a little unfortunate that it ignores its own rules later on in the film. I often wondered initially, one, whose foot that was. Two, why did they knock out Gorman like this? And the point is that had Gorman continued to be alive, the direction of the film would have gone differently. Perhaps he would have continued to make further mistakes. But in Gorman's absence, they have to make different calls. And it's an opportunity for people to actually start listening to Ripley, because she sort of persuades them in this upcoming scene that this operation is under military jurisdiction and Hicks is next in chain of command. And because of that, she's able to establish that. Hicks agrees, and she has someone in charge who's actually willing to listen to her for a change. And perhaps the only character in the film who listens to her early on is in fact Hicks. And it allows them to sort of set up the surprise with Pharaoh and Spunkmeyer, of course, because the first thing Hicks says is let's get the dropship down at the landing zone and let's get the hell out of here. Bug out and call it even, so to speak. It also allows the film to sort of expedite things. Instead of spending all this time saying what an idiot Gorman is, he can't talk. So they're not just going to sit around his body kicking him or yelling at him. That wouldn't be very productive. So instead you just have that brief exchange between Vasquez and Hicks. And then you move on to them trying to sort this mess out. From this point on, essentially Gorman is in the periphery. He's either unconscious or in the background, not really saying a whole lot, as Hicks and Ripley sort of assume command over this doomed mission. Wonderfully shot, too. I love the smoke captured inside the beams of their shoulder lamps. A bit of a brainstorming session, again, just like the crew on board the Nostromo and Alien, as they try and decide, okay, what do we do? And Ripley realizes that in this scene, that this is her chance to actually speak up and be heard for the first time in the film. Fucking A. You'll notice that Hudson agrees with her right off the bat, and the only person to disagree with her, be her foil, is the weaselly Burke. A character who we notice, by and large, is fairly easy to ignore by himself. He doesn't quite have the authority, in the same kind of false authority that Gorman did. They're able to sort of say, "Look, buddy, we're gonna do this our way." It makes him feel somewhat powerless as a villain. Not the most interesting or persuasive. Again, his argument is very transparent. He's a very transparent character, and we know at this point that he's kind of up to no good. Though again, we're not entirely sure why. and his actions don't always make a whole lot of sense. You can keep in mind, had Ripley not been invited along at this stage, Gorman would be out of the picture, and we would have Burt free to sort of negotiate with the Marines himself. Whether or not he would have any more luck with them than he does now when Ripley is in the picture is something that will forever remain open to debate. But having Ripley on board this exposition doesn't really help him in any shape or form, which only makes it more puzzling as to why he had her come along. Not something you really think about as you're watching the film, though, because constantly moving things along. Great lines of dialogue, I say we nuke the site from orbit, it's the only way to be sure. Why they couldn't have done that from the start, I don't know, but yeah, Vasquez holding her pistol, her only weapon at this point. No, she has a pulse rifle, I'll take that back. We have Spunkmeyer and Farrow, who have been absent inexplicably for most of the film. You have to wonder, have they been out of radio contact? Have they heard what's going on as their crewmates are being annihilated underneath the atmospheric processor? The script never explains. It leaves it to our imagination, but it feels largely implausible in this particular instance. A complete disregard towards protocol, taking no precautions as they leave the loading ramp open for the duration of their stay on the surface of the planet. Probably my favorite demise, just from a gorehound point of view, windshield wiper Farrow, very gory, great use of blood. Bit of blue screen there as they run to avoid the approaching scuttled spacecraft. And when it crashes into the ship, you'll notice again that a lot of the shots are fairly close up. You don't have a shot of the atmospheric processor from afar with a dwarfed explosion to kind of give you the idea of the scale of this massive thing that this ship just crashed into. And this particular set, the sound stage that they're on, doesn't look particularly massive. As far as shots go in the film, this is one particular instance where I wish that they would have had more of a larger set to sort of move around in, to make them feel sort of isolated, trapped on this planet. But they kind of feel like they're on a soundstage. We don't see them and the atmospheric processor together. You'll notice here that they're looking towards the camera and at the atmospheric processor off screen. But the only shot that we get of it and the actors together is this post shot that they did with actor stand-ins. They didn't actually have Carrie Henn and Sigourney Weaver for this upcoming shot here. And we learned that Apone was wrong earlier in the film. This place wasn't dead. The creatures were just asleep, but now they're awake. And again, that establishing shot of the two stand-in actors for Sigourney and Carrie. And now we have the first instance of Hicks sort of taking charge, explaining the situation, what they have, what they don't have. I think it works fairly well. It's them able to establish what's going on vocally, but it's necessary. What would you call it? A head count or an ammo count. It makes perfect sense in this particular instance. I always enjoyed the robot sentries. Talk a little bit more about them later. After taking the head count and sort of going through the arsenal that they have, limited as it is, they learn that they have 17 days until they can expect a rescue. And of course, Hudson's reaction really sort of sells this shot. If we just heard the number 17 days, it wouldn't mean anything to us. But through Hudson's performance, we're able to realize that that's actually really bad news. It also provides a nice foil for Ripley, someone to argue against in this scene. And she points out, of course, that, come on, tough guy, if this little girl was able to survive through this tragedy, you should too, given that she has no weapons and no training. And we have essentially Hicks and Ripley working together as a team to get through this situation. And I really like that. It's not just Hicks assuming a command by himself. He and Ripley work together to make things work. It works nicely with the fact that you have sort of a hinted romance between them, suggested only through mild or light flirtation, sort of glances back and forth, but they never let that get in the way of keeping a cool head and getting through things. Just like in Alien, where you had Dallas and Ripley who are kind of flirting back and forth, maybe very lightly, if that is suggested in a very peripheral sort of fashion. They don't let that get in the way of them actually taking charge. Keeping a cool head. Cool heads will prevail, so to speak. I like this particular instance where you have Newt moving around in the background. You can see her moving behind the actors. And we see Hicks respond. He reaches over and sort of picks her up and places her on the table. I like this shot too, where you have all these sort of mug shots of the actors as they're standing around the table. Hudson, Ripley, Hicks, looking down at this schematic. Sort of a natural response. No annoying dialogue from Newt here. She's just kind of sitting, watching, sort of curiously. A little slightly bored, though, illustrated by her yawn as they sort of talk shop. A slight joke by Hicks, flirting slightly perhaps with Ripley, but again, they stick to the plan and they don't waste any time. There's no foolish bravado here. They just get to work. I love these old school, essentially what amounts to laptops, very dated heads-up displays or readouts as they set up these gigantic machine guns. The corridor is so tight that these guns can't even move. She throws what I believe is a trash can into the line of fire, and it is subsequently obliterated. And I like that there's a certain tension that's constantly, again, maintained by Hudson. He's constantly afraid, which, again, perhaps is slightly overblown, but it serves as a reminder to us, the viewer, that, hey, be scared because I'm scared on screen. That type of fear is infectious. Again, mild flirtation between Hicks and Ripley. Her face says it all. All she has to do is say thanks. A mild joke by him and a laugh by her. But again, okay, what's next? They don't let it get in the way of what they need to do, which is keep cool heads and get out of it alive. Get a room later, so to speak. And I really like that. A shot of the corridors as the sentries keep sentinel, as it will. Hold vigil. The dutiful machines. Here we have a scene, of course, where Ripley puts Newt to bed, and I can't remember now how much of this is extended footage or how much of it isn't. I believe there's a point in this where Newt touches Ripley's nose, and Ripley calls her a sneak. Sort of a coda that they sort of address at the very end of the film when Ripley gets her comeuppance or Newt gets her comeuppance by Ripley touching her on the nose. Not something that I felt they really needed to introduce. They already have plenty of instances where these two are sort of bonding. Surrogate mother, adopted daughter. I do like some of the dialogue between them, though. My mother said there were no monsters, no real ones, but there are. Why do mothers tell their daughters that? Because most of the time it's true. I kind of like that. That idea that you have a slight comment on the slasher mentality. There are no real monsters, and yet you have monsters personified, oftentimes in slasher films. Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees. We have these ordinary situations where there are no monsters, and then you have a fox in the henhouse, so to speak. And that's not necessarily something that you have being commented on very much in this film, but you do have this conversation between Newt and Ripley here. This particular conversation about babies being made, I believe, is part of an extended scene that they sort of introduced into the film here, the director's cut. I don't feel as though it really adds anything that we need to know. I can see why they cut it out, to be perfectly honest. To be honest, I wouldn't feel entirely comfortable leaving her sleeping in a room by herself, even with a camera. Given the way that these creatures move through the air ducts, I assume that this room has some type of ventilation. These creatures, the way that they moved in Alien, or the way that the xenomorph conducted itself in Alien, it was constantly appearing or disappearing through the ducts in the same fashion, slasher-like fashion, that Michael Myers did in Halloween. It could teleport and disappear on a whim, like a ghost. So why Ripley would leave me by herself is perhaps her putting a little bit too much faith in her response time and her being able to see things going wrong immediately in the security camera. Again, yeah, you have this coda here. She calls her a sneak, and she gets Newt good at the end of the film with the same sort of trick. I could see why they cut this out, though. It just sort of makes the film... The film is already fairly long. They don't need to make it any longer. Bit of a theory, of course, foreshadowing or hinting at a potential queen. It's not something that they really explain explicitly in the theatrical version, though for the director's cut we get Hudson's theory about ant hives. Yeah, this particular shot here. Not really necessary, I think, for them to have this. I think it's the surprise in the theatrical cut of the film works pretty well. The audience, we as an audience, have our own sort of suspicions as to where these eggs are coming from. It's something that we probably wondered in the first film. And we wonder to ourselves, okay, are they going to address that here? Do they really need to spell that out for us? It's like, let us have our suspicions, let us imagine, and then have the payoff at the end by revealing the queen. How can they impound it if they don't know about it? And we learn Burke's independent reasons for coming on this trip. Ripley, of course, asks him early on in the film what's his interest in all this, and we finally learn it's money. He's not, of course, the most careful individual. Ripley is able to sort of check the logs and realize that he sent them to that ship without warning them. And again, this begs the question, why did Burke have Ripley tag along if she's only going to be a thorn in his side? Seems like a really bad idea on his part, which again only further illustrates that his actions don't really make that much sense. He's a very transparent villain. He's a very sloppy villain. And he's not an intelligent villain. His actions, his sloppy actions, cause people to die. His refusal to sort of listen or take heed causes people to die. It's not the most satisfying villain. I like villains who are a little bit more witty or intelligent, like Alan Rickman in Die Hard. It's a little bit confusing, though, why he says, Ripley, I expected better of you. I expected you to be smarter. I'm not entirely sure why he expected that of her, given that her reason for coming out, early on in the film, she made it quite clear that she wanted to wipe these creatures out. They had a very pointed conversation about that, and why he's suddenly confused as to why she doesn't want to save these creatures to try and get rich. Given that in her original report, she probably said that the only thing she wanted to do was wipe these things out. She blew the creature out of the airlock, you know. She's nothing but hostile towards these creatures. So Burke's befuddlement or perplexity as to, according to him, is a confusing reaction by Ripley, to me isn't very confusing. Her behavior isn't confusing. His confusion towards her behavior is, however. What we have here with the ammo counters essentially serves as a timer, sort of counting down to the inevitable moment when the aliens invade and get through their outer defenses. And they're going to have to scrap during the shooter gallery sequence later on in the film. A nice bit of tension where you can hear them being at the pressure door listening. Lets the viewer sort of be reminded that they are surrounded and there is no way to easily escape this threat. One of my favorite shots in the film. There's a nice sense of scale here that we don't really get through most of the movie. You can see the actors' faces sort of illuminated by the emergency venting. The crash caused too much damage, which was kind of difficult to establish given that it was such a close-up shot during the explosion that we couldn't even really tell what the ship crashed into. The explosion looked fairly small, and yet in this particular shot we realized that they have 2 hours, not 17 days. They can't sit around and wait for a rescue after all. Hudson, reliably panicking as usual, serving as a foil for Ripley and Hicks, who again, as a team, work together to find some type of solution. As a nice sort of additional element in this scene, though, where we have unexpected help from Bishop, where we learn that he is not the same type of android that Ash was. He was being quite serious when he said that he would not allow humans on the mission that he partook in to come to harm. He's not so bad after all. He's a lot more reliable than Hudson, who's constantly geeking out, panicking. I think it's deathly quiet when we hear, "I'll go. I'm the only one qualified to remote pilot the ship anyhow." If only they left one person on board the Sulaco, a steward, if you will, someone to sort of stay behind. Again, they wanted to illustrate the overconfidence of the Marines. Not something I think about too hard. It is what it is. And stupid behavior is sort of par for course for all entries in the series. Quarantine and safety protocols are constantly being ignored. So what they're doing here, it not being safe. I think it's interesting that he leaves the gun behind. Perhaps he anticipates that he wouldn't be attacked by the xenomorph. Though, of course, we learn later in the film that the alien queen happily tears him in two. Whereas in Alien Isolation, the working Joes are ignored by the xenomorphs. At the same time, Bishop, as an artificial person, is much more human-like than the working Joes, despite the fact that he's more like Walter than David in Alien Covenant. So there's definitely an android spectrum here. Bishop is more in the middle with Walter. David is on the human end of the spectrum, and the working Joes are barely human at all, essentially dolls. So unhuman-like that Stompy, the xenomorph, ignores them. Whereas in this film, Bishop is human-like enough that the alien queen tears him in half at the first opportunity. Again, we have the countdown timer here. A lot of cross-cutting as you get down to 0. The point of the scene is to illustrate how many creatures they're up against, where you have them gunning down scores of these creatures, salvos of machine gun bursts that fell them in droves to illustrate what they're up against. They're truly facing an army, and there really isn't a scene up to this point. We don't really have much of an idea of just how many creatures there are. The scene in the atmospheric processor kind of illustrates that, but each attack sort of occurs off screen. It's isolated. Opponents taken out. Wazowski and Crow are taken out. But in this scene, we have some idea of the army that they're up against. And I think that's, by and large, to the scene's, credit. We also have further illustration of how Hicks operates as a commander. He doesn't just bark orders like Gorman did. He says, look. After he sort of barks at them, he sort of pulls back a little bit and says, hey, sorry. And he's able to kind of work with them more more of fighting in the trenches as opposed to just, the lieutenant being too good to sit with the rest of us grunts. He's essentially everything that Gorman isn't, which makes him a much more able commander. It also helps that Michael Land gives a very charismatic, understandable, even withdrawn performance as Hicks. He doesn't want to be the hero, but when it comes time for him to be, he's able to perform in a way that Gordon isn't. Even when he says, in a moment of relative seriousness, that he will kill Ripley rather than let her fall into the hands of the xenomorph, he ends it, or follows it up with a joke to sort of introduce a moment of levity. And that type of social tact or awareness, again, is something that Gorman lacks, which again just illustrates how much better of a commander Hicks is than Gorman. The corporal is superior to the lieutenant in every way. He's also better with the ladies. The iconic pulse rifle, very, very interesting sort of kit bash design where you have a shotgun, Thompson machine gun thrown together, again with a kit bash sort of model to give it a futuristic sort of look. I love the design of this weapon. It's easy to understand why it's so iconic. Something that you see in the rest of the series, or referred to in other films, in video games, in commercials. It's a very iconic weapon. We have Ripley, of course, who has further autonomy at this stage. She vastly outweighs Gorman, who is, again, in the periphery, isolated or confined to the periphery from this point on. We have an interesting sort of choice to remove that discussion between her and Vasquez. We assume that she gives him the business for being such an incompetent moron, but we never see it. Instead, we go to this scene where Ripley finds Newt missing. I think this is again sort of acknowledging the fears of the audience. What mother would not respond to this and empathize with the fear that, or sudden sort of anxiety, again, to find the bed that they left their child in suddenly empty when they go in to check in on them at night. Lo and behold, she's safe, just taking shelter underneath the bed. Interestingly, hiding underneath the bed, where normally the monsters would be. Newt is hiding in the place where the monsters would be least likely to check, perhaps. I would have much preferred it had they... I like how this particular scene ends with Ripley essentially sleeping with her eyes open. We cut to the typical blue lightning, that analog effects that James Cameron loves to use in his film. We have a sort of a blue screen sort of shot of the processor in the background. A nice sense of scale in this scene. But again, sort of a close-up of this massive sort of device that he's operating. We don't have the camera pull back to realize just how large this is. The way that you would see, say, the leg of the landing leg of the Nostromo in Alien, where you see Ash in the bubble. You see the full scale of that. He's actually in the air. It's a real sense of scale with that, and you don't get that with Bishop here. But a nice use of cross-cutting and the disconnect between him and the scenes that are composed entirely of special effects. It works well. It's a 1-2 sort of combination that James Cameron uses regularly here. Now I have the scene, of course, where Ripley sort of dozed off. They do make mention of her having gone without sleep for many hours. But it seems like a sort of a poor choice, a slip-up on her part to fall asleep when they essentially only have a handful of hours to make it out of this situation. I think it would have made sense for them to, of course, have a sentry, someone watching them. They don't, however. Perhaps, again, she put a little bit too much confidence in that camera that she pointed out earlier. And we learn, of course, very quickly that Burke is responsible for this sabotage, if you will. Soundproof windows. Again, more of a storytelling device to generate tension. we realize that, again, the saboteur in this instance is Burke. He turns the camera off here, but before he does, are we supposed to believe that he performed the rest of this sabotage without anyone walking in on him or seeing him on the cameras? It's a little implausible. But, like some of the other villains in this, where the actions don't entirely make sense under scrutiny, they don't always hold water. Some of Ash's actions in Alien didn't entirely make sense either. It's not something that you're really meant to think about too hard. And the film does move along fairly quickly, so we don't have a lot of time to sort of question what Burke is doing, which is a testament or a credit to the quick editing, the brisk pace that this film moves along at. Nice bit of tension here while we wait for the creatures to jump out. Ripley is able to sort of start the extinguisher system. And again, almost immediately, like in Othello, you had Honest Iago's plan, which up until this point is maintained through lies and deception, very quickly begins to fall apart. And the moment that Ripley starts the sprinkler system, Burke's plan really doesn't hold up very well. And he was a much more transparent character than Iago. Iago, of course, in that particular play, Othello, made his intentions very clear to the audience, whereas Burke made his intentions very clear to the characters on screen. Did Ripley ever really take him seriously? I don't think so. I like that, how he just sort of hurls himself through the glass. And the contrast between the conduct, the combat approach of Hudson and Vasquez is very different. Hudson expends nearly an entire magazine of ammunition to take out an entire facehugger, again sort of continuing the comical trend that he carries throughout the entire picture, whereas Vasquez accomplishes it very neatly in a single salvo. Short controlled burst, if you will. Ready? Yeah. Boom. She's clearly a much more capable marksman than Hudson. It was Burke, so again, she never essentially trusted Burke this entire time. I would have perhaps communicated these anxieties to Hicks, the other person in charge, perhaps. Again, the important part of any relationship is to communicate. You'll notice in the background, in the periphery, you have Gorman, who again has been relegated to this voiceless role. Ripley has assumed command at this point alongside Hicks. She's perhaps gunning, so to speak, for the execution of this traitor a little bit harder than Hicks, but she's able to sort of persuade him. All right, we waste him. No offense. Perhaps a bit of a Lord of the Flies moment where any sort of semblance of order in this situation of hopelessness threatens to sort of give way to pure chaos. But of course, James Cameron draws the line very quickly and says, okay, enough of that, and he turns on the emergency lighting as the aliens cut power. So the film really doesn't take this to its inevitable conclusion of Burke being sort of executed by his own protectors. It would have been interesting to see if they could have sort of concluded this in a way that's more satisfying in regards to Burke's demise. Again, Burke is guarded by the new step and fetchit of this ragtag squad, Gorman, who has assumed his new role of servitude with a certain amount of glee, sort of almost as though he's glad not to be in command, realizing how incapable he is. But Burke's demise isn't really that satisfying. Again, he just sort of wanders off screen and dies, and it's a little bit disappointing. This scene here is what I refer to as the shooting gallery scene. It's probably one of my least favorite scenes in the film. just in regards to how it's shot, the red lighting tends to sort of bleach everything together. You lose contrast. Essentially, the faces of the characters kind of bleed into the backgrounds, and it's a little bit difficult to see what's going on, which I believe is done deliberately to sort of obscure the fact that some of the special effects don't hold up entirely well with the creatures. There's also, again, an interesting lack of acid bleeding happening during this sequence, which I'll point out as it occurs each and every time. I always like these little handheld torches that they had. Sort of a nod to the intense lighting in the Terminator with these bright, blinding lights, like the bright, blinding flashlights that we see in those films. And a similar sort of countdown here as the creatures get closer and closer. And they realize that maybe they made a mistake. It's interesting, though, that once in charge, Ripley is just as negligent to the warnings of those who realize what's truly going on as the Marines were towards her when Newt says, "Okay, it's time to go," and Ripley isn't really paying very much attention. It's a tense scene, though. You could realize how she might lose focus under these extenuating circumstances. Again, Hudson, played by Bill Paxton, sells the shot entirely. No one conveys anxiety quite as well as he does in this film. What the fuck? And then they realize that they're kind of trapped, if you will, in a cell of their own making. Ironically, they sealed themselves in the room. I love this shot, this ECU of Hicks. Again, we see his face and the horror on his face before we see what he's looking at, allowing us to very briefly imagine. Again, the lighting here as they gun down these creatures in effect, what is effectively a shooting gallery type sequence, sort of obscures the lack of special effects. From an effects standpoint, this is one of the weaker scenes. We also notice that there's a lack of blood spill there as she guns the xenomorph down directly in front of her. It's of course hard to tell how close it was to her when she shot it, just given the way that they edited that particular scene. We mostly have close-ups of the characters. We don't have aliens and characters on screen simultaneously. It's either Marines or aliens. But each time they shoot creatures, again, there's no mention of acid bleeding here. There's no hissing, no sound effects, nothing like that. So they kind of conceal through editing just how close the Marines and the soldiers are in a lot of these instances. And yet, this particular shot here, Hudson shoots the creature point blank, and there's nothing to really indicate that he's being wounded by its acid. He's just being pulled to his doom. Here, Hicks shoots a xenomorph that dives directly over him. You think the acid would spray down on top of him, but it doesn't. To its credit, the scene is edited in such a way to make things confusing, but there's no way to really disguise the fact that when you have the xenomorph and Hicks on screen together, in perhaps the one shot where you do have a Marine and an alien on screen together during the shooting gallery sequence, there's no way to really disguise the fact that he just shot a creature point blank but didn't take any acid. When Ripley shoots her foe in this scene, it's on screen or she's on screen, and there's no way to really tell how close they are together. But she doesn't take acid to the face either. Whereas Drake, who was quite a distance from the creature that was shot by Vasquez, took a face full of acid. So the movie is essentially ignoring its own rules here, which is by and large why I don't like the scene. Earlier we saw Burke come to his inevitable end, and we see how powerless and foolish he was. His quest for wealth only won him an early grave. It's not terribly satisfying, and we realize that as a villain, he's one of the weaker villains in the series. The performance isn't terrible in and of itself. Paul Reiser plays an excellent slimeball, but just by virtue of him being a slimeball, I think renders him a weaker, sort of incompetent villain in this particular instance. We have, again, another parallel with Alien, characters moving around inside the air ducts, which are brightly lit in comparison to those in Alien, with Dallas moving around in the vents. We can see all of the characters clearly, and yet they're kind of washed out by this red light, which sort of, again, bleaches out everything on screen to make everything look fairly similar visually. It's just not the most flattering way to film things, I think. This scene is, of course, designed to sort of separate the characters, divide and conquer, and holding her hold-out pistol. It's interesting to note, again, how ineffective the creature is here at dispatching Vasquez. She's the mightiest of the warriors of the team, illustrated by her constantly gunning down creatures left and right, firing grenades. And yet, the creature is unable to kill her. Its limbs are thrashing about, and yet she takes no injuries. Whereas the grass attack scene in the Alien Covenant, the thrashing or flailing of the limbs of a creature is able to knock the jaw off a character's face. But the only thing that, curiously, that Vasquez is injured by is the bleeding of acid. So again, when the script requires that a character die, they enable the acid bleeding quality of the aliens, the most effective defense mechanism. But when you have a character like Hicks or Ripley, they disable that particular function. They decide, of course, to send themselves off in a particularly explosive fashion. I love this shot here where we see Hicks sort of knocked to the side as the blast propels into the chamber. Interesting, of course, that he jams the fan, whatever it is. It almost looks like the fan that we see earlier in the film when Carrie is in her, or Newt is in her makeshift bedroom. I love the look on her face. She doesn't even have words at this point. Very briefly, she's sort of rendered speechless. Her hope is sort of temporarily restored by Hicks, ever the faithful partner. The two of them working together, he's able to sort of get her spirits up by saying, hey, don't worry, we can find her with this. They're the only two left. I actually prefer this scene over the shooting gallery because, again, we have a similar countdown. They're surrounded. The motion tracker sort of illustrates that an attack is imminent from all sides. I like this cross-cutting here, where you have people above and below this steel membrane, if you will. All the while, the clock is ticking as the alien army closes in on the remaining 3 survivors. It's a quick scene, too. It's a bit faster. And if it does seem like I'm sort of ragging on the film a bit, talking about the shooting gallery, it is probably my least favorite scene in the film overall, just in regards to how it performs visually and some of the weaknesses in the script at that particular juncture. If it seems as though I'm ragging on the film, rest assured that this following sequence, Ripley's rescue or descent into the atmospheric processor by herself, is perhaps my favorite scene in the film. I like that they're unable to fully cut through the steel and they're sort of kicking it open. And again, we see their faces. They look in. We imagine very briefly what they're seeing. And lo and behold, Newt has vanished. The only reminder that she was there at all was the sinking head of Casey the doll drifting into the water. Her reaction very suitably over the top, upset, shrieking. Well, she's kind of lost her mind at this point, and Hicks has to sort of snap her back into reality, sort of dragging her along. And for a brief moment, their roles are reversed, and he has the authority. Of course, this is very, very quickly, again, the tables are turned as he catches a faceful of acid here. Curious, though, that he and his armor takes the full brunt of this injury, despite the fact that he doesn't necessarily leap in front of Ripley. It's essentially just bad luck as he catches the lion's share of this deluge of acid from the alien blood spill. A nice sort of visual cue demonstrating the power of the acid as it eats through his armor. We see the hole in his breastplate. Again, he's effectively a knight in this situation. But most of the acid landed on his armor, not the rest of him, so he is able to... he's not completely subdued by his injuries. And the tables are turned yet again, and now Ripley has essentially complete autonomy. She is the isolated hero, the final girl of this film or a slasher film. It's not entirely, but that basic trope sort of remains, sort of crosses over into action territory as she conducts this desperate, final suicide mission. Oh, plenty. I like his reaction. Or not? He's the logical character in this situation. The Spock to Ripley's Captain Kirk. A disconnect as we see Lance Henriksen, and then we cut to a special effects shot. The model being piloted through essentially blue screen footage of the camera sort of entering into this massive atmospheric processor. Definitely a fun scene here as Ripley armors up, prepares to do battle, sort of demonstrating her ability to think on her feet, duct taping the weapons together in a similar jury rig sort of spirit that we see in Alien or Alien Isolation, where you have characters that essentially are thrown into a situation where they have to make makeshift weaponry. All the more satisfying that Ripley in this scene gets to play with actual guns. And she goes into this situation fully armed. There's no need to heed the warning that her weapon will pierce the cooling towers of the atmospheric processor. It's already damaged beyond recall. So she can go essentially ham in this situation. Fire as many bullets as she wants. And you notice she takes a bandolier of grenades. Again, the voice of reason as Bishop warns her that in 19 minutes this place is going to be a cloud of vapor the size of Nebraska. I love that line of dialogue. A very quick deleted scene here. Shot very much in the fashion in Ridley Scott's photography. These extreme close-ups or portrait shots of the characters lit very well. A lot of detail and grime on their face in the same fashion as the characters on the Nostromo were dirty and grimy and lit in just a certain way. The elevator sequence here. Normally elevator rides are kind of boring, and yet James Cameron is able to make this kind of exciting. Partly due to the fact that James Horner's score works particularly well here as she loads her weapon. Something that Cameron likes to do in a lot of his films. You see that with Sarah Connor in Terminator 2 loading her shotgun, feeding shell after shell very slowly into the feeding chamber of the shotgun. She does that. Ripley does that here. Takes off her shirt, and sort of a reversal of roles gender-wise. We have, instead of John McClane running around the Nakatomi Plaza or towers in his wife beater, we have Ripley taking off her jacket to essentially wear her white shirt stained with sweat. Very much a visual trope of the action heroes, the male action heroes of this era. And now we have Ripley doing that as a woman. Essentially, instead of the final girl trope that we saw in Alien, where Ridley Scott sort of reversed the gender roles, we have James Cameron doing it with the action heroes. One of my this is my favorite scene in the film, by far. You have sort of everything coming together. You see where the budget of this film went in regards to the set, essentially we have a fun house or a haunted house sequence where Ripley, as the action hero, makes her way through, of course, inspiring Samus Aran in Metroid in 1986. Metroid was released, perhaps they were inspired by Aliens, or you have that action heroine combined with certain slasher motifs to create this interesting hybrid or amalgam. Similarly here, just everything looks beautiful. The way that the light shoots through the grates, it's very photogenic. A lot of interesting photographic techniques in regards to capturing light through smoke, sound effects that sort of coincide with the visuals on screen, the rotating lights that constantly keep everything glowing or flashing, as she makes her way through claustrophobic corridor after claustrophobic corridor, and everything feels varied. And you'll notice that it's lit in a certain way too. The initial sequence underneath the atmospheric processes were brightly lit, and here it's lit much more in the style of Ridley Scott's Alien. And it works a lot better, because everything is obscured by fire, shadows, smoke, and steam. And we have a close-up here, a nice sort of ECU of Ripley. We can hear the heartbeat, very much in the same fashion that we do in Alien. That heartbeat, that animalistic quality to the Nostromo, is lent onto the atmospheric processor, giving it a life of its own. She's entering the belly of the beast. Of course, all of this is sort of underscored by the constant beeping. There is no music in this scene. It's silent. It is a scene that is maintained entirely by the visuals, by the visual power of the scene, but also the sound effects, that constant, incessant beeping as she makes her way deeper and deeper inside. One problem that I do have with this scene is, of course, the geriatric facehugger here. Very similar to how the screenwriters disable the acid-bleeding defense mechanism of the creature, we have a curious sort of instance where they disable the speed of the facehuggers emerging from the eggs. They do not leap explosively from the eggs like they do in Scott's films. Rather, this creature can barely crawl out of its egg, perhaps sort of commenting on the premature quality of newborns, the obstetrical dilemma of the xenomorph, as it were, where you have something that is born premature, it's sort of weak or sickly. They essentially de-weaponize it, which the purpose of being to keep Newt alive, to keep her ostensibly in danger when she is effectively in no danger at all. The creature isn't even able to escape the egg before being shot. My favorite shot, probably of the movie, you can see the xenomorph leaping from wall to wall, strings included. They weren't able to sort of disable them in post, as it were. A nice little shot that sort of demonstrates, everything photographically is demonstrated here in this scene, just while she's underneath the atmospheric processor. But you do have certain post-production shots that kind of worm their way in, but they're few and far between. I do wish, again, you see those computer-generated pipes amidst the real fire. They could have easily cut those bits out and just had the fire from the cameraman's point of view as Ripley is conducting her rescue. It would have worked fine. Great whoosh sound effect as the smoke sort of drowns out the destruction behind her. And suddenly you have an interesting moment of isolation where she finds herself sort of cocooned inside the womb of this alien colony. What could this be? And again, giving us time to imagine when we see her looking at whatever it is that she sees, giving us enough time to imagine whatever it is. And through cross-cutting, it is revealed. Great use of special effects here with plastic bags filled with maple syrup. It's a great use of something that you could essentially buy at a yard sale or the Home Depot, but they turn it into something that's actually fairly convincing on screen. And I like how the queen here is essentially shrunk. The way that she's sitting sort of disguises her true size. The largest part of her is her crown, which again, her face is tucked into. And as she sort of unfolds and sits upright, we can see the tail moving in the background. Her face sort of emerges from the crown and her jaws release, revealing a mouth that is much larger than we might have thought initially. Ripley is essentially waking up the slumbering queen, who doesn't realize what danger she's in. In this situation, of course, Ripley is sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. I love visually how it's shot as well. That heat wave that they're able to sort of procure as they photograph her. Nice sort of static camera sort of attached to the queen's head as it looks down at Ripley. There's just a lot of great photographic techniques. They spared no expense in regards to making this scene look as photographically pleasing as possible, using every trick in the book photographically. Smoke, slime, sound effects, you name it. And an interesting sort of intelligence illustrated by the creature here as they negotiate, without words, no less, for her release, her escape. Of course, the egg opens up, and we do say that perhaps she overreacts a little bit. But had she continued to make her escape without responding the way she did, would the facehuggers have chased her down in this situation? She did have to do some type of response. I will argue, however, that it is a bit gratuitous, given that she expends all of her ammunition. Perhaps a single jet of fire would have sufficed to sort of subdue the facehuggers to guarantee that they would not pursue her. She does have to, of course, contend with the warrior aliens that approach one at a time conveniently enough. And again, the screenplay sort of allows them to not overwhelm her. Perhaps the numbers of the army have been whittled down at this point. But we know better than that, given that during the shooting gallery sequence, there were plenty of aliens, and yet the Queen's special temple guard, as it were, is limited to maybe a mere handful, and that most of the aliens are actually out and about. Great use of gore effects here. Very satisfyingly, she destroys the cocoon egg sac, effectively neutering or eating the ovaries of this alternate species in the wild. She, of course, does not catch any blood, despite shooting that creature point blank with repeated salvos from her weapon. Again, the screenplay requiring that she survive in a very transparent writing device. A minor quibble that I have in an otherwise excellent scene. If anything, if Ripley was going to, say, dispatch the entirety of her arsenal in a single sort of deluge, perhaps she could have devoted some of her grenades or bullets to the alien queen. But given the creature's size, perhaps she expected that it might not have been able to pursue her through this claustrophobic maze. But, like a cat, perhaps the creature is able to squeeze through openings that you might not think possible otherwise. A great use of overdubbing the sound of Ripley's voice breathing heavily, gasping in the same fashion that she did while navigating the maze, as she did in Alien. Again, a parallel between those two films. Yet in this film, Ripley spent a majority of the scene trying to get into the exploding situation, whereas in Alien, Ripley was trying to do nothing but escape. Now we have a return to that idea here, where Ripley, with her Waard in arms, is attempting to escape this dying world, pursued by someone that she thought or anticipated would not be able to follow. Clearly she was wrong in this situation. The look of sheer panic on Sigourney Weaver's face really sells the shot. Interestingly enough, in this scene, I like that bit of blue lightning next to the alien as it makes its appearance. You see a real sense of scale in that brief shot where it and Sigourney Weaver are on screen at the same time. We have Jerry Goldsmith's score, Sleepy Alien, which is used when Ripley is confronted by the beast in Alien. So we have an audio-visual parallel between those two films here. Perhaps whatever James Cameron wrote, or James Horner wrote, for the score wasn't satisfying. Perhaps they just wanted to make a pointed reference to that film, Alien. And certainly the rest of the scene certainly draws numerous parallels when Ripley trying to escape the Nostromo. Here she's trying to escape the planet. You have Mother sort of counting down. There's explosions and fire everywhere as this station falls apart in the same sense that the Nostromo is falling apart. And this great sort of the cadence, if you will, of Jerry Goldsmith's score as we see her standing on the platform to realize that Bishop is nowhere to be found. I do wish that they could have conveyed the sheer size of this panel that she's standing on, surrounded by this dying facility. You have plenty of disconnects or effect shots, actors, effect shots, but you don't really have a single shot that effectively conveys. Again, this shot here where she's holding onto Newt, the explosions in the background, is largely a close-up. We don't have anything that really gives a sense of scale to the situation that she's in. Some of the shots look pretty good, though. That collapsing pillar and the sound effects. Some of it works pretty well. I think by and large the debris looks fairly clutterish. It doesn't look quite as substantial as it perhaps could have, but this is the tail end of a very excellent scene, I might add. Ripley has escaped the hive. Perhaps my favorite moment musically. This is a pretty good shot here of the blue screen shot of the model behind them as she holds on to Newt. Close your eyes, baby. Wonderful music by James Horner, those leaping sort of arpeggios. Amidst the chaos of this scene, we lose track of the Queen, that we learn later, of course, stows away on board the ship during their hectic escape from the dying planet. The rising music here, not entirely sold on the debris there. It looks a little tinfoil-ish. And this is where things get pretty awesome visually, of the model of the ship navigating his way, threading the needle of the dying processor. Again, wonderful windows, them flying through the smoke, the atmospheric processor passing beneath them in the lower left-hand corner. And this expedited shot of them flying away, the ship rising towards the camera, the characters illuminated from the sheer intensity of this explosion in a single burst, unlike the triple hat trick explosion that we see in Alien. I think this works much better. And we see just enough of it to realize what a tremendous blast they narrowly escaped from. It really speaks volumes to the editing here, where they're able to sort of communicate a lot visually without really dragging it out like they did in Alien. Some of the analog effects that they used to animate the explosion in that film didn't really convey the same oomph that we saw in this explosion. And we have a false moment of security as we are lulled essentially to premature sleep by James Horner's score. Are we supposed to believe that everything is fine? And we have another parallel with Alien where we have the final battle on board the escape ship, if it will, being a mothership and not a lifeboat. We are led to think that they're in the clear, when in fact there is a final battle between Ripley and the alien, just like in the first film, albeit in a slightly different fashion. Nice jump scare here as we see the tail protruding through Bishop's chest, tent pulling, but then pushing through the fabric as milk spurts in fountain-like fashion from his mouth. We realize that he's human enough for the Queen to not disregard him completely, and she, of course, subsequently annihilates him in glorious fashion. You might argue it's a bit of censoring to have it be an android who is ripped in half. It could have very easily been Hicks had he not been injured the way that he was, but they went with Bishop being torn in half, and they're thus able to be a little bit more gratuitous in their delivery of the gore in this situation, because again, he bleeds milk, not blood. Had it been a human ripped in half like that, perhaps this film might not have got an R rating. And we have some nice shots of Ripley and the Queen in the same shot together. No post-production effects for this particular scene. It's merely photography and puppetry to essentially bring this fight to life. Is it entirely plausible? No. But it's the kind of thing that James Cameron wanted to address. He wanted a cat fight, essentially a fight between two mothers from two different species. Earlier on in the film, Ripley, of course, neuters the queen, destroys her reproductive organs, and now we have the queen sort of vying for revenge, aiming for Ripley's offspring, attempting to destroy it in the same sense that Ripley did to her in the hive. Not my favorite shot in the scene. I always thought, the queen is a little bit slow here, though eventually she's able to pull off behind door number 3, mute. Just in the nick of time, though, Ripley, again embodying the action hero, a female action hero in a male-dominated genre, emerges in her suit of armor. If you ever wondered where the inspiration for Samus Aran came from, it's this scene. Another parallel between this and Metroid, Samus Aran fighting to avenge the death of the Metroid larva in Super Metroid, fighting against Mother Brain. Again, you have mothers from 2 different species here fighting to the death. Wonderfully shot, wonderfully photographed. Is it entirely plausible that Ripley would be able to overcome this powerful animal, even in the slow, clumsy sort of power loader? Perhaps not, but again, the sheer craft of bringing the scene to life sort of distracts you from some of the perhaps sobering realities of what actually would happen if the 2 of them fought. I certainly would not want to fight the queen in a power loader. The armor isn't very protective. She's exposed. It's more of a gambit than anything. And yet, for whatever reason, it works. Largely due, again, to the visuals, the sheer craft and photographic virtuosity of the people behind the camera, as it were. Another sort of nod to Alien, where Ripley sort of surreptitiously opens up the airlock, pushing buttons while distracting the creature simultaneously. The basic idea behind Alien and Aliens in regards to the final fight isn't really that different. Cosmetically, the scenes are worlds apart. But the basic execution, not so much. This is perhaps where things get a little ridiculous. The idea that, of course, Ripley was able to sort of she was able to remain conscious during that fall. You see that, of course, she's taken a blow to the head, but is not knocked out. The alien queen is, of course, pinned underneath the loader at this point. And this is where things get a little bit too hyperbolic for my tastes. At this point, are we really supposed to believe that the alien wouldn't be strong enough to pull Ripley off the ladder before she had a chance to open the airlock? And even if she were able to sort of open the airlock, the fact that she's able to hold on is a little unrealistic. Shall I say, damn near impossible. And yet, she's able to resist the pull of the vacuum of space, and resist the pull of having this gigantic alien holding onto her foot. There's just really no way that that would happen. But again, it's a very expeditious scene. In Alien, when the xenomorph is jettisoned into outer space, it's very slow, dreamlike, and we just kind of watch it sort of fade into outer space. Here, the queen is out of the picture and gone for good, and the exciting music sort of cheers Ripley along as she makes her final ascent. It works musically, it works visually. Not entirely plausible, but it is tremendously entertaining all the same. Some great shots of her hand as she sort of squeezes into the grates, in the same way that the queen did when it was trying to grab Newt earlier in the scene. A visual parallel, if you will. 2 hands of different sizes performing the same action. A nice little commentary here. Bishop really doesn't have a lot to say in regards to his nature of being an android versus his human masters, but he does say this: not bad for a human. Perhaps his first and only attempt at humor throughout the entire film. I like his smile. He tries to smile reassuringly, despite being covered in his own blood and ripped in half. We have Michael Bain, Michael Bain and Lance Henriksen in their cocoons. And again, we have a return to the sterile environments of Kubrick. Everyone is clean, surrounded by this white, spotless sort of interior as they prepare to go to sleep. Ripley has, again, sort of donned her space underwear in the same sense that perhaps this is where they got the motivation for Samus to sort of disrobe from her armor in Metroid. And we're treated to a view of Ripley in her space bikini in the same sense that at the end of Metroid we are treated to a view of Samus Aran in her undergarments, revealing that underneath that armor, underneath the sort of hard, tough exterior, is the body of a nurturing woman. And we have sort of, again, the final parallel between Alien and Aliens, the shot of them close up, sleeping together side by side, in the same sense that Ripley and Newt, a mother and her surrogate daughter, in both films concludes in the same fashion. You also have the musical coda, if you will, Aram Khachaturian's Gaian Ballet Suite, being reprised for the end of the film. When the characters are sleeping in the beginning, so too do they sleep to the same music at the end of the film. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this commentary. I tried my very best to sort of steer away from regurgitating what Cameron and company said in 2004 for their commentary on the Alien Quadrilogy. Instead, I tried to just sort of explain what leapt out at me myself. Ron Cobb, the conceptual designer here. I'm not sure what they mean by that, if he designed the sets or things like that, in the same sense that he did in sort of a returning member from the original Alien cast or crew, whereas Geiger, of course, is curiously absent. Stan Winston sort of took over duties designing the creatures, even if they were based on Geiger's work. Anyways, however, guys, I hope you enjoyed the commentary. Aliens is a movie that I appreciate quite a bit. I do have certain scenes that I don't like, mainly the shooting gallery sequence, or certain moments where the screenplay sort of turns off the creature's ability to bleed acid, or the idea that Ripley is somehow strong enough to sort of resist the pull of space while being pulled into the void by the alien queen, her essentially counterpart or double opponent, her alter ego even, if you want to analyze it like that. But by and large, there are a great number of scenes in this film that I really appreciate. It's a wonderfully made film. Despite the fact that it has certain impurities, there's much to appreciate about it. And I hope that you enjoyed this commentary. And I hope that you enjoy Aliens as much as I do. It truly is an entertaining film, a nice addition to the Alien universe, and one that I do think people are right to sort of worship and recognize as a canonical entry in what is a franchise with a fairly checkered past. Anyways, guys, if you like the video, like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more content, and until next time, thanks for watching. Take care.